Welcome everybody. My name is Lisa Armstrong. I'm the Associate Director at the UMass Lowell Innovation Hub. Also here with me is my colleague Stephanie Guyette, Associate Director at the Innovation Hub in Haverhill, as well as our boss, Tom O'Donnell, Senior Director, Innovation Initiatives. The UMass Lowell Innovation Hub is a business incubator and co-working space. We serve early stage technology companies, entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses with office space, co-working space, programs and events, as well as many resources to support entrepreneurs, including a direct link to UMass Lowell resources. So like everyone, we've had to take our programming to virtual. And while both spaces are open, we do have members that are coming in and utilizing our spaces, which is great. And we follow strict protocols for cleaning, sanitizing, mask wearing, and maintaining social distancing. And we're glad that we're able to continue to operate and support our members at this difficult time. If anyone would like more information about either Innovation Hub, maybe Steph, you wouldn't mind putting a link to our website into the chat, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. We've been working really hard to offer members and the community valuable virtual programming. We invite distinguished guest speakers to join us to discuss many different topics. Today, we're fortunate to have a faculty member from the UMass Lowell Manning School of Business. We're really excited to have him here today. We are recording this session and we'll share the link with you in case you are not able to stay on with us the whole time. We do encourage you to use the chat feature during the session for any questions or comments. We'll be monitoring that and saving questions. Actually, we're going to interject with questions. We won't save them all for the end. So feel free to share why the session is of interest to you today, or tell us where you're coming from. One benefit of being virtual is that we get people to join us from all over the world, and that's been pretty neat. I'd also like to thank my colleague Stephanie, who's worked with me to put this program together, and who's going to help me with the question and answer as well. Our topic today is crafting business models and strategy, the balancing act all organizations, big and small, must perfect. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is also happens to be a friend of mine. Dr. Latham is a UMass Lowell Associate Professor in the Manning School of Business. He is an expert on issues surrounding strategic planning, organizational turnaround, and business startup development. He worked for 12 years in the software industry, where he experienced both the highs and lows of the dot-com boom. After leaving industry in 2005, he earned a PhD in strategic management. His research focuses on organizational decline, environmental turbulence, and innovation. It has been published in top journals in the field, including Academy of Management Review, Journal of Management, Journal of Small Business Management, and Harvard Business Review. Dr. Latham has also been featured in many popular press outlets such as NECN, MSNBC, Entrepreneur Magazine, Mass High Tech, and Boston Globe, and the Boston Herald. Thank you again all for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Latham.
Thank you, Lisa. Before I get started, can everyone hear me okay? Sound check, Lisa, Tom, thank you. Okay. So as Lisa indicated, my name is Scott Latham, and I am a professor here at UMass Lowell in the Manning School of Business. I primarily teach undergraduate and graduate strategy. I also teach a course in the future of work, which is looking at how disruption, largely technology, now COVID, are changing the way we do our jobs. And I'm thrilled to be here today. Before I get started, I do want to thank Tom O'Donnell, Lisa Armstrong, and Stephanie Guyette for having me here at the iHub. For those of you that aren't familiar with the iHub, as Lisa suggested, it's debatably the crown jewel of UMass Lowell. We are an institution that is steeped in innovation and engineering and the sciences, and we're also the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. So to know that innovation is alive and well here at the iHub in the middle of the Hamilton Innovation Canal, it really is it's a wonderful place, and it's a testament to the hard work of Vice Provost Steve Tello, Vice Chancellor Julie Chen, and others that have kept innovation central to what Lowell is. So today I want to talk about business models and strategy. And I hope to the degree we can in Zoom and in the short hour that we have, can have a discussion about it. It is something that I think is on the forefront of anyone involved in business, in strategy. And as I look at the presentation today and setting the stage, I would tell you that I think business model and strategy, as well as the term innovation, are overused buzzwords that have been so overused that they've come to mean nothing. And I hope to provide a little clarity and some explicit direction relative to business model and strategy. So we'll talk a little about the business model. and then to illustrate some of the ideas that I'll introduce, we'll talk about Redbox, which for those of you here in the US, I saw that we had someone in Ireland as well. I'm not sure if Redbox has locations there. Their business model and whether or not they have a strategy, because the two are distinct concepts, but interrelated. We'll talk a little more about how you integrate the two, and then finally, how you see whether or not you're in balance, because the notion is that you need both. And then we'll end up with questions and comments. Now, having said that, I know Lisa and Stephanie are checking the chat box. Feel free to interrupt me at any point in time, and I'm happy to talk about it. So I worked in the software industry during the dot-com boom and bust. And I will tell you, and in some of the articles around this is where the term business model got originated. And every company at that time had a business model. Strategy wasn't good enough. You had to have a business model. You had to have a business model for your investors. You had to have a business model for your partners, for your customers. And in general, most of them were horrible. And that's why we had the dot-com bust, because they were ill-defined business models. I don't think a lot of folks knew what it meant to have a business model. And so as I left industry in the mid-O's, I got a PhD in 2005, became a strategy professor. I always was interested in small startups and how they define their business model and strategies. Apart from my industry experience, I am on the board of M2D2, which is spearheaded by Marianne Picard here in the iHub. It is our medical device accelerator and incubator. And so I have a lot of experience working with small medical device startups as well. And I can tell you firsthand that their business model and strategy is always on the forefront of what they're thinking about relative to their own organization. But as I said, it's become a word salad. These are terms that I've heard, and I culled them in pulling together the presentation. We have the only business model like it on the market. At the heart of our strategy is our business model. We have a great business model. We are more focused on our business model. We are more focused on our strategy. Our business model equals our strategy. Rather than focus on the business model, our strategy is ... Our strategy equals the business model. Our business model is fluid. Strategy paints a big picture. And my favorite, and this is one that's kind of well covered in the press, with our business model, we lose money on a unit basis, but we make it up on the volume. The point I'm trying to make here is that folks have lost the strategy trees or the strategy forest for the business model trees. Very few folks can articulate a concise conceptualization of either strategy or business model. Very few folks can articulate the difference between them. And very few folks can articulate the relationship between them. And they get caught up in the tools and the frameworks around business model and strategy. And then I think what happens in dealing with strategists and leaders and managers, both in the profit and nonprofit sphere, is they lose the strategic thinking related to both of them. And that's what I hope to convey today. And so the three objectives that I have today for you, and I value your time, is one, that you understand what a business model is. And for me, as a preview, that's when you're trying to win the customer. The second objective I have is that you understand the difference relative to strategy. And strategy is how you're going to beat the competition. And then third is the integration and the balance between those things. If I can achieve those three objectives and at least give you a sense of that understanding, then this will have been a good use of your time. Now, I would say I have colleagues on the line today. And I remember last semester before COVID hit, sitting in my office debating the notion of a business model with Michael Chuchta, professor in marketing. And we had a very healthy debate. I've talked at length about business models with Liz Altman, a professor in strategy, with Jose. My perspective on this is just mine. But I hope that it illustrates the fervent debate that goes on in the scholarly community about these two ideas. And I would also say that my colleagues have shaped my thinking on this, especially Michael, Jose, and Liz. So let's talk about the business model. What is a business model? And you may think of the tools again. So this is the business model canvas from Osterlander, Osterwalder, excuse me, and Pignor. This is Christensen's business model from the Harvard Business Review. This is the business model out of Cambridge across the pond. There are different tools of the business model, different manifestations. But I think in, again, losing the forest for the trees, we forget, what is a business model? What does it mean to have a business model? And for me, the business model basics, very simply, and this is a great article by Andrea Ovens in the Harvard Business Review, is she talks about a business model as a story, simply a story about how you're going to win the customer. And again, that gets to my 3 objectives. The business model is always about how are you going to win a customer. For a definition, this is mine. It's basically a set of interrelated processes within the organization that deliver value to the customer, the value proposition, at a profit for the company. So there's 3 distinct pieces to the business model. The value proposition, why does the customer engage us? The operation model, how is the value delivered? And the economic logic, how do we do so profitably? Regardless of the tool, this is what it means to have a business model. Many of you don't have a business education. Many of you probably have never even read the Harvard Business Review. But in leaving here, I hope again, boy, a business model. How do we win the customer? And these are the 3 parts. Central to the business model is a notion of value and an idea called jobs to be done. If we think about the value proposition and why someone comes to an organization, why they are a customer, there's a job that they have that needs to be done. And that's central to the idea of value. The very famous professor, Theodore Levitt, said that when someone buys a drill bit, they're not buying a drill bit, they're buying a hole. And for me, it's one of the best anecdotes in business scholarship. Because if you think about the hole, you could get a drill, you could get a ray gun, you could hire a carpenter and she could come out and drill the hole. You could buy a robot and the robot could get the hole. It's the drill versus the hole. It's the understanding that all of those 4 things, they're the means to the value. And the real reason that the customer engages you is the whole. The whole is the job to be done. And that cuts across all industries. So it's central to the business model to understand what the value proposition, what is the customer trying to accomplish? Similarly, Peter Drucker, a very famous managerial scholar, talks about, who is the customer? The purpose of a business is to create a customer. And the way you create a customer is understanding that customer value. And that speaks to the value proposition. The value proposition of the 3 components, the economic, operational model, the value proposition is the most important. The value proposition is the heart of the business model. And it should inform every aspect of those things that the company does in creating and delivering that value. So that's objective 1. That's setting the stage for how we craft a business model and strategy and how we integrate and balance those. So if someone after this presentation said to you, what's a business model? You could say, well, a business model is a story about how we're going to win the customer. And we're going to win the customer by delivering and integrating 3 components: understanding the value proposition, the jobs to be done, the underlying economics that we're doing it profitably so we can be viable, and the activities that are central to creating and delivering the value. So I want to offer an example that was somewhat a theoretical exercise in understanding what a business model is. And before I go into the next section, any questions, any comments? Stephanie, Lisa, anyone out there have any questions or comments?
No, not yet. We're monitoring.
All right. So we're going to talk about Redbox. This is a good example for me. And the question I would ask to you, how many of you by show of, they can't engage. I'm sure many of you, people can't raise hands, Lisa, or anything?
They could raise a hand, yeah.
Okay. How many of you?
Or they can unmute themselves, Scott, if they choose.
How many of you have used Redbox and are familiar with Redbox? Okay. Well, it looks like Steve Tello raised his hands. Well, that's funny because Redbox is aimed at that older demographic that can't stream stuff yet. So the question I would put out lot of raised hands. So we're all familiar with Redbox. Redbox fascinates me as a business professor. For many of you that don't know, Redbox was founded and invested in initially by McDonald's. McDonald's had envisioned putting Redboxes outside of all of their locations in North America. And in the wake of Blockbuster's collapse and Netflix's rise and then streaming, it seems like a very, very curious business model. But I do think they have a really great business model. And to use it, I'm going to use the business model canvas, which, Lisa, can they see my screen, my face, if I hold something up or?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the book. This is the book that I use at the graduate and undergraduate level. I know a lot of programs do. Came out again about 10 years ago, and it's a wonderful tool for better understanding the business model. The business model canvas is the tool into the three parts that we just talked about in Redbox. They have a central value proposition around newness, brand, price, accessibility, convenience, and usability. They have key activities and processes to build that deliver, both on the inward facing side of the organization and the external side of the organization. And the third part, if you remember, is they do it profitably. The per profitable business on a Redbox machine is incredibly profitable. Less so, they're starting to decline as streaming gets more widely accepted. But their business model was incredibly innovative at the time. So let me ask you a question. We have Redbox, and tomorrow you leave a local Walgreens and you go to rent your movie, maybe Tenant or some other new release. And then right next door to it, you see another company, Blue Box. And I would put out to the attendees and ask it somewhat rhetorically, does Redbox still have a good business model? Yeah, they do. And I would argue that there's now more value here to the customer. Because what now, if you look at it, Blue Box and Redbox, identical business models, right next door to each other, the customers now have more option. And remember, this is the key distinction between a business model and strategy. The business model is meant to be a vehicle for delivering a value to the customer. And both of these companies do. The customer still gets value. And now that they're competing on price in the absence of strategy, the level of value is higher. So there is no Blue Box. And lucky for Redbox, they do have both a strategy and a business model. With regards to the business model, we just broke it down. They have those three components relative to their strategy. And again, as a way of previewing, the business model is how we deliver value. Strategy, for lack of a better word, is how we protect the business model. Strategy is about an interrelated set of processes that create competitive advantage and protect our business model. And how does Redbox have a competitive advantage? Well, they have the exclusive rights to a 20 by 20 piece of real estate outside of every Walgreens in North America. That's strategy. And one of the things in teaching strategy is that it's curious to see where it comes from. And here, it was a lawyer. It was a lawyer either on retainer or on staff at Redbox that basically said, hey, we have a great business model, but we got to protect it. And how do we protect it? We protect it through exclusivity. And that is the heart of strategy. That's how you beat the competitor. More often than not, I get students that confuse strategy with marketing. Certainly marketing is a piece of strategy, but it's not everything about strategy. So what is strategy? And again, one of my colleagues here, Liz Altman, earned her doctorate at the Harvard Business School and has worked with some of these people that have written this material. This came out 2 days ago, and I cut it and pasted it in the presentation. And what it is that, this article, it's an old article, about 20 years old, 25 now, 1996, written by Michael Porter answers the question, what is strategy? And it's still one of their top 50 best-selling articles. It speaks to this presentation in that there's a business model and there's a strategy. And with regards to the business model, I tried to offer some real discrete and tangible aspects relative to the business model. And now I want to do the same relative to strategy. Strategy isn't the tools, just like the business model. You know, it's funny when I talk to people, hey, do you have a strategy? And they'll say, well, we did a SWOT. Great. You know, that's as if I was talking to a carpenter and I asked them if they built a porch, and she said, or he said, I had a hammer. There's a difference between the tools that are used in strategy and the outcome of strategy.
Can I interrupt you for a question real quick?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Does marketing equal tactics in this case? Previous slide.
Yes, and more so what it represents is a component of what's called the value chain. And I think you could, again, conceptualize the value chain, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. It's the interrelated tactics. There's no one strategy that derives solely from one set of tactics like marketing. More often than not, if you look at successful companies, they pull together a stew or a bundle of tactics, and they do it well. And they do it so that those activities reinforce each other and demonstrate a high level of fit. So, am I good to go, Lise?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, you know, we have the SWOT, we have the Boston Consulting Group matrix, where companies know their cows and their dogs and their stars and question marks. We have our 5 forces model, which looks at whether or not an industry is favorable. The point is none of these are strategy. And remember, the goal for me today is so that you think deeply about these things. Don't just fall back onto the tools, but think, how am I going to win the customer? How am I going to beat the competition? That is what we're trying to discuss today. So the strategy basics, again, drawing from the larger scholarship and the research, the question, how do I win against a competitor? And how do I protect my business model? In protecting your business model, usually, or always, it's a function of building a competitive advantage and doing things differently. A lot of companies get caught up in the notion that we do things better. And doing things better relates to a term called operational effectiveness. You know, it's getting someone through a drive-through quicker, getting a baggage off the plane quicker. Better isn't strategy. Different is strategy, and having a competitive advantage based on difference is really what we need to do to protect our business model. So here, there's no strategy, no different processes, no doing anything different. It's identical, but still 2 great business models. What has to happen is Redbox, again, contractually had to protect their business model, and that's what they do. Here's a quote from Clayton Christensen article from MIT Sloan Management Review. And for me, in preparing this presentation, I think it's incredibly relevant to drawing a distinction between strategy and the business model. Your business model is always under attack. This quote, they look at the fintech, financial technology startups, and see their business models being unbundled and attacked at every point in the value chain. I'm going to talk about the value chain in a second. But what they're speaking to is the fact that folks see your business model and they're going to reverse engineer it. You have to have a strategy that is somewhat covert. Think about, you know, for example, I'm playing Monopoly with my kids or cribbage with my father or any competitive endeavor. You don't tell them your strategy. And that's what has to happen here. Time is the enemy of any business model. You have time on the horizontal axis and strength of business model on the y-axis. And whether it's strong or weak, initially out of the gate, it's strong. But then people start breaking it down. And then at some point, the business model fails altogether. And that's what strategy is designed to go up against. So where does that happen? And I think someone had a great question relative to marketing. And understand as well that some of these concepts are covered in 8-week, 10-week classes. This is the value chain. And this, again, is a very common framework and strategy. And the argument here is that in the value chain, that's where we do things different. That's where you create a set of interrelated processes that support and protect the business model. And we all know them very well. The primary activities are inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, and post-sale service. And then the support activities are HR, the infrastructure of the company, R&D, and procurement. The challenge for you as a manager is not micromanaging, but understanding where you can protect the business model within these activities. And so if we go back to Redbox, their operations, their infrastructure, specifically around legal, the procurement of the movies, and the service of the machines. These activities are behind the scenes. They support the value proposition. They protect the value proposition. The average Redbox customer doesn't care if you have a 20-year or 10-year agreement with Walgreens. All they care is they can walk out and rent a DVD. And that's the distinction. So that's objective 2. That's strategy. Strategy is about beating the customer, fighting off father time, developing a competitive advantage that protects the business model. Understanding that competitive advantage resides in a set of interrelated activities, the value chain, and that a business model without a strong underlying strategy is on borrowed time. So I want to go a little more now into the integration of the business model and strategy. But before I do, in the next few slides are designed, and as I pulled the presentation together, this might be the first time you've seen the value chain. This might be the first time you've talked about a business model. But I'm pretty sure in the next few slides, you'll understand the whole idea of an iceberg.
Just one question, Scott.
Yep,
sorry.
Shoot.
Is beating the customer a typo? Should it be beating the competition?
No, that's strategy is about beating the competition. How you protect your business model relative to your competition. That's at the heart of strategy.
Thank you.
So when you think about strategy and business models, I need you to think about penguins and icebergs. Okay. The adage of the iceberg is that 10% of the iceberg sits above the water and 90% of the iceberg sits below the water. I don't know if it's true. I think it is, but it offers a really good adage for today's presentation. So if we think about the business model and the penguins, the value is realized and delivered here at the top, with strategy being hidden and underneath. That's where it's protected. Another great example of this relationship between business model and strategy is Netflix. Netflix, if you think about it in their value proposition and their business model, and we could define it differently. Some of you may view it differently, and every customer gets a different value from its engagement with the organization. Real-time, personalized, surprising entertainment. Why is it surprising? Their own content, the fact that I log on and they offer me a different program every time I log on. That's the value proposition. That's why they win the customer. But their strategy is deep capabilities in the interrelated processes relative to understanding the customer. It's all their data capture, all their data analysis, all their data, when they leverage the data, when they recommend new programs. As I said, business models are always under attack. So you have Peacock, you have HBO Max, Disney Plus. They're all going after Netflix's business model. The issue is they'll never beat them because Netflix has time on their side. The real value of Netflix in their business is here. It's that deep understanding that they've built now in 20 years about their customers' viewing preferences and habits. Peacock, HBO Max, Disney, they lack all of it. And that's the strategy for Netflix, how they're going to beat the customer. I want you to think of the iceberg relative to your business. The business model is customer facing. It's the value. The strategy is how you protect it. So most business models, like I said, they're evident to the customer. I mentioned it earlier. They don't care what happens in the background. No Redbox customer cares that there's a contract protecting the location. And if you do look at the research, customers like to think of their engagement often as a magic act. No one likes to know how you're pulling the rabbit out of the hat, but they appreciate the complexity of it. And so strategy should be out of the sight of the competitors and out of the sight of the customer. And going back to some of the initial things, you have a business model. This is the business model canvas and the 3 components. And as a visualization, underneath the business model is the value chain. And so up here, the value is created, and down here, the value is protected. You need both, and you always have to constantly assess, is the business model valid? Is it disrupted? Is our competitive advantage still valid? And based on that, you find that companies typically fall, and I have in my own research, and this is from a paper that I wrote with a co-author of mine, Michael Braun, companies fall into one of 4 quadrants. They're either heavy on the business model or they're heavy on the strategy. And a company with a weak business model, but a competitive strategy or unique competitive advantage, company like Segway, tremendous IP, tremendous technology, light years ahead of everyone else. But if you know a little about the company, they never could find the right business model. They bounced around. Law enforcement, commuting, tourist industry. They had this incredible technology, but they couldn't find a business model. Under Armour, similarly, a year ago, people would have told me Under Armour was one of the best athletic leisure companies on the market. They've lost both their strategy and their business model. Their strategy, the thing that separated them, was a lot of their advanced fabrics. Their business model was going after the college market, and that's kind of gone sideways relative to college athletics and the rights of the college athlete. So Under Armour is in big, big trouble. Blue Apron, company with a great business model, again, delivers a lot of value to its customers. The problem is there's about 6 other companies out there that do the same thing. They're competing on cost, just like Redbox and Blue Box. Good business model, a lot of value for the customer, horrible differentiation, no competitive advantage. And then I hate to use someone who's in the press all the time, and I know their stock just tanked yesterday, but if you look at someone like Tesla, they, again, incredible business model. Their strategy is one of an integration where they're going right across the value system. For me, it's why they're as successful as they are today. And that's objective 3, understanding the play and the need to balance between the business model and strategy. So I have about 15 minutes left. I want to open it up to any questions, but I want to wrap up. You know, I had a conversation with one of my colleagues, Mauricio, about what comes first, the chicken or the business model, or the egg and the strategy, playing on the whole, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. It doesn't matter. You know, it really doesn't. That's where I've come to arrive at it. I think there are some organizations that they tend to have a good business model and then they back into a good strategy. And there are some folks that have a good strategy and then need to better define the value. The point is, you have to balance them. And so to the second question, Lisa, that you asked, business model is about how are we going to win a customer. Strategy is about how we're going to beat the competitor, and they're interrelated, and you need both. Here's some further reading. Strategy and business models, an article I wrote. What is a business model? Why business models matter? What is strategy? Comment on that article earlier. There's a lot of material out there. And I think it's, again, like I said, something we could spend 8 weeks in a graduate class really dissecting. To that point, if you do want to learn more about business models or strategy, UMass Lowell has some of the best graduate programs in the nation. We were just ranked the top MBA program here in New England. So our graduate online and professional studies division can, you can either enroll in an existing program, work with the corporate education team, and get to know more about business models and strategy and make it more relevant to your own context and help your organization out. So I've been talking. Zoom is horrible to present on, as I'm sure many of you know. I hope this was somewhat helpful, a lot in 45 minutes. I know it's recorded. You're always welcome to reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions or feedback right now.
Great. Thank you, Scott. That was awesome. If anybody has a question, you can throw it in the chat or feel free to take yourself off mute.
But I'll start while we're waiting for some questions to come in the chat. What do you think? Do you have an example of a business that has succeeded because of COVID in terms of, basically every business got a new competitor. If you look at COVID as a competitor and had to pivot and change, do you have an example of somebody that maybe turned that into a winning strategy in 2020 and 2021?
So I'll give I think a general comment on that, and then I'll offer a specific. Generally, here at the iHub on the floor above us, through some federally funded grants, M2D2 is working on existing diagnostics and testing that were for other diseases and ailments. And these companies now are rapidly pivoting to address issues relative to COVID. Smart companies are doing what's called that type of micro pivot. It is commonly called an incremental innovation, a learning innovation, a flexible innovation. And then there are other companies that have just, I'll give you a great example, Instacart. Instacart was being left for dead right before COVID, and then COVID hit, and just from dumb luck, they had a business model and no strategy, and now it looks like they're able to my previous point, pivot to the COVID. There's also the obvious examples of Amazon, FedEx, UPS. Sadly, there are some organizations, most of them large, that have benefited from COVID. There are very few small organizations on Main Street that have. I hope that answers your question. So
a few questions have come in, Scott. Can you talk a little bit about how this might apply to nonprofits?
Nonprofits, yeah, nonprofits. I'm working with a nonprofit now, and they are in workforce development. I think I'm going to contradict myself here. If you think about the balancing act between the business model and strategy, with a nonprofit, I think more emphasis should be placed on value. And that's some of the discussions I'm having now. I think especially during COVID, and for this organization, coming back and really recentering the organization around the value that you provide to your constituencies is critical. So I think for a nonprofit, of the two, I think you start with the business model. I think you start with the value proposition and ask that simple question: why are we here? If we disappeared tomorrow, who would miss us? And you can have that relative to Drucker. Drucker's whole point: a business needs to create a customer. I think with a lot of nonprofits, it's more of a central question around value, especially given the pain in the economy. I don't know what this nonprofit is, but I think that's my take.
There are two more questions, but how can Segway improve their business model?
They can't. They're done. They're cooked. Yeah, they can't. They're out of business. They're bankrupt. I know the parent organization's still around, but they couldn't. They bounced from business model to business model to business model to business model. They had great technology.
And then a couple people have the same kind of question on this. Do you have process resources and or recommendations for businesses working to define or better define their business models and strategy?
I do. These are tough questions. And I think, so the first thing is, I think you go out and you read. This is a new book, What is Strategy? I have my doctorate in this stuff. I've been doing this forever, and I'm still wrestling with these terms. And that's the beauty of teaching strategy. Every context is different. And so as far as process goes, I think, you read about these things and then you get engaged, with quick micro credentials. You come out to UMass Lowell, the competition, Babson, Bentley, Harvard, MIT, they have short courses for these things. And you have to keep yourself honest. When people come to me, and let's just talk about the notion of a business plan. I always tell people, you don't write a business plan for an investor, you write the business plan for yourself. The business plan is an exercise in being honest. Same thing here. And I think that's the value that a professor like myself or Liz Altman or Mike Chuchta, that's what we provide. We keep you honest. We stop you from deluding yourself about the level of value that you believe you're providing your customer. There's some great readings out there. The other one that Jobs to be Done by Clayton Christensen and Harvard Business Review. It's a seminal article, and it's so simple, and it's so powerful in its simplicity, and it's around what is the job that the customer is trying to accomplish, and then seeing the power of the value proposition. But yeah, I think as far as process goes, it's reading, getting immersed in it, talking to folks that do it independent of yourself, and then joining industry organizations and seeing what's going on in the industry, because I think that gives you a sense for where disruption's happening and where novel and creative strategies are emerging. So.
Okay. Do you want another one, or?
Oh, sure. I'm here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
where do you factor in barriers to entry in the business model / strategy? Or
barriers to entry is always strategy. Again, the customer doesn't care that you have a barrier to entry. It's strategy should be trying to design those barriers to entry. In effect, the Redbox, Blue Box example, in getting contractual rights to Walgreens, to Market Basket, that is a barrier to entry, because you can't, where are you going to put your Redbox? On the woods? So barriers to entry is always a strategic idea relative to the structure of the industry. So.
Okay. Another question. I think you hinted strategy lasts for a long time. Business models are short-lived. In that context, should strategy, or the question how to beat the competitors or clones, precede the business model, and how to win the customer?
It's that chicken and egg thing. I do think it's a balance exercise. From my experience in software, in medical device, it typically starts at the business model and then goes very quick to the strategy. And then there are other businesses, like Petrochem, for example, they start with the strategy, they start with structure. There are some industries that are more, not to get too professory, theoretical, that you can find a favorable structure quicker and maybe get away with having a bad business model. I think in dynamic, innovative industries, you need to have a rock solid value proposition. So, but I see Mauricio and Liz and Mike here, so they could debate that with me.
Do you have any favorite examples of creative strategies that you'd like to share with the group?
I think Redbox is one. I'm a big fan of Blue Apron. I just am. Because I was a customer. I'll try to, be a customer. I'll give you an example. So this semester, my undergraduate class, we go deep in an industry and try to rotate it. We've done outdoor recreation. We've done the retail industry. We've done, airline industry. This semester, given COVID, we're doing the retail grocery industry in the United States. Incredibly dynamic industry. We're looking at Aldi, we're looking at Amazon Go, we're looking at Market Basket. So when I look at interesting strategies and a well-balanced strategy and business model, it has to be Aldi. Aldi is a small grocer from Europe. When I lived in Sweden 20 years ago for 18 months, I saw them over there, and they are eating American grocers' lunch. And it's a fascinating strategy and business model. So right now, that's one I'm just focusing on in class. So.
Okay, one more, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Can you differentiate at all between a business model declining over time because of competitor attacks to it versus natural life cycle of a product and failure to make an adjustment to the product or service?
Let's see, a business model that's declined over time. I'm not thinking because I don't want to do the evident ones. Trying to think. It's declined over time. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. Have them email me on the side.
Okay. I think they said you showed a slide where it just declines.
Yeah, just over time, eventually what happens is people copy it. They come out with the same business model. The technology disrupts it. New entrants come into the market. Over time, the business model eventually just gets copied because you see it. So.
Okay. And just one more, what are some revenue strategies that can be used for free apps? Most of them focus on different membership levels. Is there anything else that can be used?
Yeah, I mean, that gets to the sort of component, you know, what's the cost basis? What's the revenue basis? You know, the classic example for the person that's asking this, because I think it's something to, there's an article from the Harvard Business Review. Now it's 20 years old. It came out during the dot-com boom called Judo Strategy. The article is entirely focused on Netscape and how Netscape used alternative revenue models relative to giving away the application for free, much like apps, to initially beat Microsoft. So I think I would steer them to reading that article. So Judo Strategy.
Okay. Let's see. I can give a declining business model. Beauty education traditionally required significant investment for bricks and mortar facilities, but the advent of online learning has allowed for almost unlimited smaller suppliers. So, comment.
No, agreed. I didn't want to use that one. It's so evident. Here's another one is the university bookstore. University bookstore, the business model has declined. You know, and a lot of these institutions like UMass Lowell have a very strategic asset. You know, think about it. UMass Lowell, we have 20,000 students, and you have this real estate in the center of campus with a dedicated, locked-in audience. Yet the business model and value has just declined. And so I don't, you know, what you do there. Traditional restaurants, spending some time now with last semester's class, we looked at the restaurant industry and we looked at ghost kitchens. These ghost kitchens are attacking that traditional restaurant business model in the notion of value. I'm 50 years old. For me, it's a joy to go out and have dinner with friends and families. That's the value I derive, that connection. These ghost kitchens are going after the value that folks that are younger than me, where they want convenience and speed and assortment. It's just a very different business model. The restaurant industry, because of these ghost kitchens, is in big, big trouble.
I don't see any other questions coming out.
Okay.
So just lots of great comments for you, Scott. It's a great session. Everyone really thought it was useful. So
I hope so.
Good.
Yeah, so there's a lot to debate here. So.
Right. So thank you again for speaking today. We appreciate you being with us, and thank you for everybody for joining us as well. We will again be sending out the recording to everyone. We'll follow up with an email when that's ready. Otherwise, we hope to see you again, and everyone have a great afternoon.